Could you survive on meals made from scraps, flour, and sheer desperation? During the Great Depression, families across America created dishes that were cheap, filling, and surprisingly tasty. And here are the poor man meals you absolutely need to try. When empty stomachs and lean wallets collided, innovative cooking blossomed across American kitchens. One standout born from this economic squeeze was Hoover Stew, a tongue-in-cheek homage to President Herbert Hoover, whose name, during tough times, humorously became synonymous with empty pockets. The stew cleverly combined cheap hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and any stray veggies lurking in pantry corners, exemplifying creativity born from necessity. This simple yet hearty recipe embodied affordability and accessibility, as families everywhere could easily scrounge up its ingredients. Fascinatingly, cooks often swapped in leftovers, stale bread, wilting greens, or bits of onion, masterfully reducing waste and maximizing resources. Despite its humble origins, Hoover Stew was surprisingly flavorful, with the acidic tomatoes enhancing the smoky saltiness of hot dogs, making families forget, at least momentarily, the scarcity around their dinner table. Though it was called a stew, it often turned into a thicker, casserole-like dish, leading many housewives to jokingly rename it Hoover Surprise. No matter how much you stirred it, you'd never find prosperity at the bottom of the pot, just another spoonful of macaroni. Amid the widespread struggles of the Great Depression, families turned kitchen staples into culinary innovation, and a standout was a surprisingly sweet yet humble dish known simply as butter and sugar noodles. Pasta, butter, sugar, three affordable ingredients commonly stashed in Depression-era pantries, came together to transform mundane noodles into something unexpectedly comforting and satisfying. This creative approach, driven entirely by necessity, exemplifies how families cleverly adapted to limitations without compromising taste. An interesting twist was that leftover pasta from dinner often made a comeback the next day as a sweetened breakfast, effectively reducing waste and maximizing resources. Affordability and accessibility were vital, and this sweet noodle dish quickly became a favorite because of its simplicity and budget-friendly nature. Sure, nowadays the concept might make a gourmet chef cringe, but back then, those sugary noodles felt like dessert disguised as dinner, an acceptable indulgence when treats were scarce. Parents occasionally sprinkled cinnamon or nutmeg on top, convincing skeptical children that they were eating something far more exciting than just buttered pasta with sugar. During an era when store-bought meals were rare luxuries and wasting food was unthinkable, resourceful cooks relied heavily on their gardens, pantries, and plenty of improvisation. It was precisely under these circumstances that biscuits topped with tomato gravy became a beloved staple in Depression-era households. The dish was ingenious, showcasing creativity born from necessity. Leftover tomatoes, often bruised or overripe, simmered down slowly into a savory, thickened gravy, perfectly illustrating how reducing waste and maximizing resources became a domestic art form. Affordability and accessibility played pivotal roles too, as biscuits required only a handful of pantry ingredients like flour, shortening, and milk. Interestingly, tomato gravy was especially popular in southern regions, not only because tomatoes thrived there, but also because folks humorously declared, "When meat's missing from your gravy, tomatoes step right in." In fact, many Depression-era families fondly recall tomato gravy as their saving grace, turning otherwise plain, dry biscuits into satisfying meals without breaking their limited budgets. Amid scarcity, Depression-era households leaned heavily on resourcefulness, turning even the simplest pantry staples into nutritious meals, leading directly to the rise in popularity of peanut butter bread. With just flour, peanut butter, sugar, and baking powder, home bakers concocted this hearty loaf, demonstrating remarkable creativity born from necessity. The affordability and accessibility of peanut butter played a significant role. By the 1930s, this creamy spread had transitioned from a health food for the wealthy into a cheap protein source for everyone. Interestingly, peanut butter bread required no yeast, a clever adaptation considering yeast was costly and sometimes unavailable, further reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians note that newspapers eagerly published this simple recipe, promoting it as the ultimate economical dish, sometimes even humorously suggesting peanut butter could single-handedly keep America strong. Many Depression survivors fondly remember slicing this loaf thinly, stretching its lifespan for days, or toasting stale slices for snacks, exemplifying an era when food waste was practically criminal. In times when families counted pennies and every slice of bread mattered, resourceful home cooks mastered the subtle art of turning stale loaves into irresistible treats. Take, for instance, the humble yet beloved cinnamon toast, a simple concoction of bread, butter, cinnamon, and sugar, elevated through creativity born from necessity. This Depression-era favorite thrived due to its affordability and accessibility, requiring only inexpensive staples most homes already had on hand. But here's an intriguing fact. Originally, cinnamon toast wasn't simply breakfast fare. It frequently appeared as a satisfying after-school snack or even a dessert, proving families' ingenuity in stretching resources. Frugal mothers transformed stale bread, usually destined for the birds, by crisping it in the oven, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. An amusing anecdote from Depression cookbooks revealed that some creative cooks joked cinnamon and sugar were miracle workers, magically resurrecting even the toughest bread heels into sweet treats children clamored for. Though cinnamon toast might seem basic by today's gourmet standards, during the 1930s, it represented an affordable luxury, a delicious reprieve from endless soups and stews. Long before pancakes became a diner staple, Depression-era families turned to Johnny Cakes, a humble cornmeal-based flatbread, as a trusted source of inexpensive nourishment. Originally introduced by early American settlers, Johnny Cakes saw a resurgence during the Depression, becoming popular again due to their affordability and accessibility. Made from little more than cornmeal, salt, and water or milk, this simple batter transformed into golden, crispy patties that creatively replaced costly ingredients like wheat flour or eggs. Resourceful home cooks often pan-fried Johnny Cakes in leftover bacon grease or saved drippings from other meals, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Families got creative, too. Some would sweeten these cakes slightly with molasses or honey, while others spiced them up with savory leftovers, stretching a modest meal into something memorable. Food historians share an amusing anecdote. Because cornmeal was abundant and dirt cheap, some folks humorously called Johnny Cakes the poor man's pancake, a nickname many wore proudly, turning frugality into a source of culinary pride. Few Depression-era meals evoke nostalgia quite like the hearty duo known as beans and cornbread. In homes where budgets were stretched thin, pairing protein-packed beans with simple, inexpensive cornbread wasn't just tasty, it was brilliantly practical. Dried beans, easy to store and remarkably affordable, found their match in cornbread, made with cheap cornmeal readily available in nearly every pantry. Here's where creativity born from necessity truly shined. Cooks would simmer beans slowly, sometimes flavoring them cleverly with bacon scraps or garden-grown herbs, turning limited supplies into deeply satisfying comfort food. Interestingly, cornbread had a dual role. Not only did it stretch a meal to feed extra mouths, but leftover cornbread was frequently repurposed, crumbled into soups, stews, or transformed into next-day stuffing. Talk about reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians have noted this humble pairing provided crucial nutrients too, ensuring struggling families stayed nourished despite financial hardships. Beans and cornbread even inspired a beloved jazz classic in the 1940s, capturing American hearts and stomachs in song, a sure sign of its enduring significance. While egg drop soup might evoke images of your favorite Chinese takeout, Depression-era Americans had their own inventive take on this classic dish. When times got tough and wallets got thinner, families turned to an American-style egg drop soup, cleverly crafted from simple ingredients that were affordable and accessible. Usually, it was nothing more than broth, often just salted water, if we're honest, with a single precious egg carefully beaten and slowly drizzled into the simmering liquid. The egg stretched surprisingly far, forming delicate ribbons that turned plain broth into something more substantial. Food historians note that cooks, driven by creativity born from necessity, occasionally enhanced the soup by sneaking in leftover vegetables or even stale bread crusts, brilliantly reducing waste and maximizing resources. There's even an old joke from the era. Families humorously called it egg drop soup because that's exactly what they did. Drop in one egg, cross their fingers, and hope nobody noticed the absence of meat. Despite its humble composition, the warm broth offered important nutrients and protein, essential during a time when these were scarce. When Depression-era homemakers faced piles of leftover mashed potatoes, tossing them out wasn't even on the menu. Instead, they turned to the wonderfully versatile dish known as mashed potato pancakes. With affordability and accessibility in mind, this clever recipe utilized basic kitchen ingredients: leftover potatoes, flour, egg, and perhaps a sprinkle of onion or herbs if they were lucky. By frying these ingredients into golden brown pancakes, cooks skillfully transformed last night's side dish into today's main attraction, proving their ingenuity in reducing waste and maximizing resources. Beyond economy, potato pancakes became a Depression-era favorite for their satisfying crispness, turning humble leftovers into something you'd genuinely anticipate. Creativity born from necessity drove home cooks to experiment by folding in diced onions, stray ham bits, or even a dash of paprika, crafting variations that rivaled their breakfast cousins at fancy hotels. Amusingly, families soon realized these pancakes were so deliciously economical that purposely making extra mashed potatoes became standard practice. Few dishes better capture the ingenuity of Depression-era cooks than bologna and rice casserole, an inventive marriage of modest ingredients that was both filling and budget-friendly. Rice was cheap, available nearly everywhere, and could stretch even the most limited pantries, while bologna, well, let's just say it wasn't winning culinary awards, but it certainly scored high marks for affordability and accessibility. Interestingly, the casserole's popularity was boosted by the era's government relief programs, which often provided surplus bologna to struggling families. Ever-resourceful home cooks quickly realized the processed meat's potential, combining thin slices or chopped bits with rice, canned tomatoes, and occasionally leftover vegetables lurking in their ice boxes, expertly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians point out that clever homemakers might dress up this casserole by layering in spices or sneaking in leftover cheese, a creative touch born purely from necessity. A running joke at dinner tables was that bologna and rice casserole was the great equalizer. Since wealthy or poor, no one was immune from the economic pinch, and apparently bologna didn't discriminate either. Faced with pantry shelves lined mostly by oats and root vegetables, cooks during the Great Depression found surprisingly innovative ways to keep meals affordable and accessible without sacrificing taste. Among these humble innovations was savory oatmeal with onions, a dish that swapped the sweet comfort typically associated with oats for a robust, flavorful alternative. Since oatmeal was inexpensive, readily available, and shelf-stable, adding onions was a practical choice driven by creativity born from necessity. Housewives sautéed sliced onions, sometimes incorporating bits of leftover meat drippings or bacon fat saved carefully from previous meals, proving once again that reducing waste and maximizing resources was central to Depression-era cooking. Interestingly, historical cookbooks from the 1930s describe oatmeal as versatile enough for any meal, not just breakfast, highlighting how people cleverly adapted common ingredients into uncommon dishes. A popular Depression-era saying humorously advised hesitant eaters, "If onions can't fix your oatmeal, nothing can." And yet, despite its unusual combination, the dish worked surprisingly well. Caramelized onions provided a savory depth that transformed oats from plain porridge into an unexpectedly hearty, satisfying dinner. When fresh meat vanished from dinner tables during the Great Depression, clever home cooks across America transformed simple staples into meals that were both satisfying and surprisingly sophisticated. One dish that embodied this culinary ingenuity was spaghetti with butter and garlic, a modest yet flavorful creation championed for its affordability and accessibility. Pasta was cheap, Garlic bulbs grew easily in backyard gardens, and butter was often the only indulgence that squeezed through tight household budgets, making this meal the perfect ally during financial hardship. But here's a little-known historical gem. Many immigrant families introduced this garlic-infused comfort using recipes carried from European homelands and creatively adapted due to economic necessity. Leftover spaghetti was often intentionally cooked in larger batches to reuse the next day, thereby cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Housewives humorously called it the gourmet dish without the gourmet budget, noting that despite its humble ingredients, it carried an air of Mediterranean flair. In the Depression-era kitchen, stretching ingredients became a necessary art form, transforming humble ground beef into a flavorful comfort classic known as hamburger gravy on potatoes. Families embraced this hearty dish because ground beef, though modest, was accessible and affordable, especially when cooked with pantry staples like flour, water, and onions, creating a rich gravy that masked how little meat was actually used. Creativity born from necessity meant that cooks thickened gravy generously, ensuring it filled hungry bellies even when servings were modest. Interestingly, homemakers often intentionally prepared this gravy with more potatoes than beef, cleverly maximizing resources by relying on inexpensive starches to provide satisfying bulk. Historical accounts recall Depression-era parents jokingly referring to this gravy as luxury sauce, playfully elevating its status at the dinner table. Though in reality, luxury rarely appeared on their grocery lists. Additionally, leftover gravy would frequently return to the menu the next day, reheated or thickened, creatively reducing waste and reinventing yesterday's meal into something equally delicious the next night. This resourceful gravy and potatoes duo, considered by historians as an economical solution to nutritional challenges, became popular nationwide precisely because it turned ordinary pantry staples into something genuinely special. During the Depression, families looking to feed hungry mouths often turned breakfast into dinner, a practice that brought hash browns and eggs into regular rotation at evening meals. The brilliance of this dish lay in its simplicity, leveraging affordability and accessibility by combining humble potatoes and eggs, both readily available and inexpensive staples. Shredding potatoes into crispy hash browns was not only an inventive solution for stretching pantry supplies, but also a clever way of reducing waste and maximizing resources, as even slightly soft or sprouting potatoes could still shine when grated and fried crisp. Interestingly, during the 1930s, eggs became an essential dietary staple due to their relative affordability compared to meat, providing crucial protein without straining tight household budgets. Creative Depression-era cooks, never short on innovation, occasionally mixed in leftover bits of ham or diced vegetables into the hash browns, turning yesterday's scraps into today's flavorful feast. When meat became a luxury during the Great Depression, resourceful home cooks discovered inventive ways to transform pantry staples into flavorful, satisfying meals. One delicious example being macaroni and tomatoes. Often affectionately nicknamed poor man's spaghetti, this modest dish featured canned tomatoes combined with budget-friendly macaroni noodles, exemplifying affordability and accessibility at their best. Cleverly, families frequently repurposed leftover stewed tomatoes or sauce from previous meals, effectively reducing waste and maximizing resources without sacrificing taste or nutrition. An interesting historical tidbit: macaroni was among the first affordable processed foods readily available nationwide, making this pairing an accessible solution for struggling households. Even though macaroni and tomatoes relied on just two humble ingredients, cooks creatively enhanced flavor with whatever herbs they had growing outside: oregano, parsley, or even wild chives. Proving creativity born from necessity often produced tastier results than gourmet recipes. And speaking of creativity, Depression-era homemakers occasionally added leftover bacon drippings or grated hard cheese, humorously transforming simple pasta into something fancy enough to impress neighbors. At a time when expensive ingredients rarely made it past grocery lists, Depression-era cooks took humble foods and transformed them into flavorful comforts. One classic that emerged from these kitchen experiments was the egg sandwich with mayonnaise. A dish so simple yet so satisfying it became a household staple. Eggs offered affordable protein for struggling families, while mayonnaise, commercially mass-produced since the 1920s, was surprisingly accessible even on modest budgets. Interestingly, mayonnaise itself soared in popularity during the Depression because its creamy texture and tanginess helped mask the blandness of otherwise sparse meals. This sandwich demonstrated creativity born from necessity, as many families stretched 1 or 2 eggs across several sandwiches by mixing them generously with mayo, thus cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Homemakers would joke that mayo held Depression cooking together better than glue, and honestly, given the circumstances, they might have been right. Beyond thriftiness, eggs became popular due to their versatility. Leftovers from breakfast could easily reappear for lunch, tucked between slices of bread, often toasted to disguise staleness. Families enduring the hardships of the Great Depression found sweet relief in a humble, comforting dessert they lovingly called Apple Brown Betty, a delicious testament to creativity born from necessity. This timeless dish turned inexpensive staples like stale breadcrumbs, apples, and sugar into a warm, irresistible treat, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Breadcrumbs, often destined for disposal, found new life layered between slices of budget-friendly apples, providing both affordability and accessibility to struggling households. Interestingly, historians suggest this sweet bake actually predates the Depression, tracing its roots to colonial America, but its popularity soared in the 1930s as cooks embraced inventive ways to stretch limited supplies. Some witty homemakers joked that Brown Betty was less of a recipe and more of a miracle, transforming yesterday's stale bread into today's delicious dessert. During this difficult time, homemakers rarely discarded bruised apples. Instead, skillfully hiding imperfections beneath cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, baking until golden brown and bubbling, effectively reducing waste and maximizing every ingredient. Depression-era cooks knew a thing or two about making meals stretch, so it's no surprise that biscuits and gravy rose from humble country kitchens to iconic comfort food status. With meat scarce and household budgets stretched thinner than grandma's rolling pin dough, home cooks cleverly transformed simple ingredients into dishes that satisfied entire families. The beauty of biscuits and gravy rested in their remarkable affordability and accessibility. Flour, milk, shortening, and perhaps leftover sausage drippings became the foundation of this hearty meal. In some homes, the gravy contained just a whisper of meat, leading folks to joke that their gravy was vegetarian by accident. Creativity born from necessity truly shined here as cooks thickened gravy with flour and milk, turning meager supplies into something genuinely craveable. To further maximize resources, biscuits were often intentionally baked in excess, allowing stale leftovers to be reheated, crumbled into soups, or repurposed in savory casseroles later that week. Facing lean cupboards and even leaner wallets, Depression-era cooks perfected the skill of turning ordinary ingredients into comforting meals, like the ever-reliable tomato soup with saltines. More than just canned tomatoes and crackers, this simple dish captured a culinary snapshot of the era, reflecting affordability and accessibility at their finest. Families stretched cans of tomato soup with extra water or milk, cleverly expanding each portion while sneaking in some nutrition. Saltines, which hit grocery shelves as early as the late 1800s, were inexpensive pantry essentials and cleverly used by home cooks to add bulk and texture. Interestingly, tomato soup gained notable popularity in America during the early 20th century, especially after Campbell's introduced their condensed version in 1897, just in time for folks to discover that thinning soup was easier than thickening wallets. Reducing waste and maximizing resources was key, with homemakers crumbling stale saltines into soups to prevent waste, often jokingly calling it croutons for the budget-conscious. Some inventive cooks even combined leftover vegetables or milk into the tomato base, demonstrating creativity born purely from necessity. While today's macaroni and cheese often comes in neon orange boxes, Depression-era cooks perfected their own homemade version, homemade macaroni and cheese, without a hint of processed powder in sight. In a time when boxed convenience foods were scarce or considered a luxury, Resourceful homemakers created this comforting meal using inexpensive staples: macaroni pasta, milk, butter, and modest amounts of cheese. Interestingly, Thomas Jefferson himself is credited with introducing macaroni and cheese to America, having encountered it during his travels to Europe, though even he likely didn't imagine it becoming a Depression-era culinary hero. Its popularity during the 1930s arose not just from affordability and accessibility, but from its flexibility. Cooks creatively adapted the recipe, substituting scarce cheese with stretched white sauces or sneaking in leftovers to give the dish more bulk, clearly demonstrating creativity born from necessity. They joked that this dish was so adaptable, even cheese-free macaroni and cheese could somehow pass as a believable dinner option when times got especially tough. In kitchens where meat vanished quicker than paychecks, homemakers of the Great Depression era discovered a creative, albeit eye-watering solution for lunchtime: onion sandwiches. This modest sandwich leveraged affordability and accessibility since onions and bread were inexpensive staples almost always within reach, offering families something flavorful without stretching the grocery budget. Slices of fresh onions nestled between generously buttered bread, sometimes enhanced with mustard or mayonnaise, became surprisingly popular, though it's safe to say breath mints probably weren't Depression-era priorities. Despite jokes that onion sandwiches kept romantic interests socially distant long before it was popular, this creative culinary strategy arose from genuine necessity. Families embraced onions not only for flavor, but because they contained vitamin C, a nutrient scarce when fresh produce was limited. Historically fascinating is that this sandwich wasn't merely the invention of struggling Americans. Immigrants from Eastern Europe had long enjoyed onion sandwiches, demonstrating that sometimes necessity sparks international culinary inspiration. When traditional baking ingredients became luxuries few could afford during the Depression, resourceful cooks found innovative ways to deliver satisfying bread to their tables using little more than cornmeal, boiling water, and a pinch of salt. This ingenuity gave rise to a crispy, golden brown treat known affectionately as hot water cornbread or hot water cornbread, depending on where you grew up. This simple recipe, hot water mixed directly into cornmeal and fried crisp, demonstrates affordability and accessibility at their finest. Historically, the origins trace back to Native Americans, who, centuries before the Depression, combined cornmeal with boiling water to create nourishing cakes. But the 1930s breathed new life into the dish, as cooks embraced it for requiring fewer ingredients than traditional cornbread, creatively born from necessity. Depression-era families appreciated that these humble cakes required no milk, eggs, or expensive shortening. Housewives humorously noted the dish required nothing fancy, just boiling water, cornmeal, and sheer desperation, highlighting its role in reducing waste and maximizing resources. Back in a time when store-bought desserts were off-limits for most American households, resourceful homemakers turned their attention to economical recipes, ingeniously crafting sweets from ingredients hiding in their pantry. Among these inventive treats was the comforting creamy delight known as baked rice custard. This humble dish showcased Depression-era creativity born from necessity, transforming leftover rice, often deemed too dry for a second act, into a silky, gently sweetened custard baked to golden perfection. Using accessible pantry staples like milk, sugar, eggs, and rice, cooks discovered an affordable and satisfying dessert that cleverly embodied the practice of reducing waste and maximizing resources. An interesting historical nugget is that rice-based desserts date back centuries, originally popularized in Europe before becoming an American comfort food mainstay during hard times. Homemakers humorously referred to it as the dessert that rescued rice from eternal exile, making yesterday's leftovers today's culinary star. During the Depression, milk and eggs, though somewhat scarce, were prioritized for nutrition, turning this custard into more than just a sweet treat, but an essential source of protein and calcium. When cabbage was plentiful but budgets were anything but, Depression-era cooks took kitchen creativity to a whole new level by pairing shredded cabbage with noodles, creating a hearty, inexpensive classic known as fried cabbage and noodles. Historically, this dish traces back to Central and Eastern European immigrants who brought their culinary traditions to America. But it surged in popularity during the 1930s, when affordability and accessibility mattered most. Resourceful cooks realized that cabbage, plentiful and hearty, could stretch further when paired with pasta, transforming two humble ingredients into a satisfying meal. And here's a surprising twist. Many homemakers would cleverly fry cabbage in bacon drippings or leftover meat fat saved from previous dinners, masterfully reducing waste and maximizing resources. Families often joked that this dish had a magical ability to multiply, like those mismatched socks in the laundry basket. It seemed there was always more left over than initially prepared. Fried until golden, cabbage turned sweet and slightly caramelized, perfectly balancing the blandness of boiled noodles. In Depression-era kitchens, stale bread was never destined for the trash bin, not when a resourceful cook could conjure up something deliciously practical. Instead, savvy homemakers soaked stale bread in milk, tossed in a handful of raisins, sprinkled in sugar and spice, and transformed scarcity into the timeless comfort known as bread pudding with raisins. Born from frugality and ingenuity, this comforting classic soared in popularity during the 1930s precisely because it prioritized affordability and accessibility. An interesting fact, although bread pudding recipes date back centuries, Depression-era cooks redefined them by turning leftover bread heels and crusts, often considered too stale to eat, into mouth-watering desserts, effectively reducing waste and maximizing resources. Some cooks even joked their bread pudding improved with age, claiming the older the bread, the tastier the result, but perhaps their sense of humor was just as resilient as their cooking skills. Raisins, another economical pantry staple of the era, added sweetness and iron-rich nutrition, crucial when meat became an occasional luxury. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. The underdog of the Great Depression pantry was turnips, the scrappy little root vegetable that was always at every table. Turnips, with their peppery bite and rock-bottom price, became the saving grace for families who were stretching every penny. Turnips were not just a root to roast, mash, or toss into soups, but a kitchen multitasker. So many families stockpiled turnips during those lean years because they could turn a bare-bones meal into something hearty and comforting with just one turnip. Poor soil was no problem for turnips, which made them a good crop for struggling farmers. In a root cellar, they could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for winter when other fresh vegetables were long gone. But creative cooks came up with ways to bake them into casseroles, pair them with potatoes to stretch a mash further, or pickle them for a tangy treat. Sweetened turnip puddings, for instance, surprised many with their richness. Even desserts weren't off limits. Turnips aren't a staple of the grocery cart these days, but they've worked their way into farm-to-table menus and rustic recipes. They weren't a trendy choice back then, but they survived in vegetable form. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak, and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. Boston brown bread, or otherwise known as Boston town bread, is something that went viral in upstate New York and other parts of the Midwest like Ohio and Illinois. This is right out of New England cuisine, and the most common partner in crime you could expect to see with Boston town bread was a side of baked beans. You could also just use it as a filler food and dip it in stews, soups, or have it with curries, but this is a pretty old-fashioned bread. It's admirable how it managed to keep up with the times, but unfortunately, the times never made life any easier for a bread like this. You see, steaming bread was a little too intensive. It was a hard process, and it was a time-consuming one more than anything else. Towards the massive boost in the production of white bread that I talked about earlier, people began to realize something. They really want their bread fast. More than anything, nobody had the attention span to wait more than the time it took to toast a single slice of bread. That meant that breads and loaves that actually required delicate work and baking skill went right out of the window, and with pay cuts breathing down on our neck for every second we go missing on company time. That's something I can understand. At least the corporate world will always be the same, even if the culinary world keeps forgetting classics. If you take a look at the history of Brooklyn, you'll find something that was really popular, which was ham cheese balls. These were the perfect bite-sized appetizer to gorge yourself on while you waited for the main meal. A lot of grandmas would have handwritten notes tacked onto family cookbooks about how to make the perfect ham ball, what the ratio of meat was, how much cheese you needed to put in, how much you needed to roll them and shape them before they were perfect. It was one of those snacks that just did well everywhere. In Iowa, too, it was one of the most easily available snacks you could find anywhere in the state. All in all, it's one of the best things to ever come out of the Midwest, and no Christmas is honestly complete until you down a platter of ham cheese balls and make the tray look spotless. Have you ever grown up around these? Do you still remember the taste? Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South in African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration, a crucial feature for families without electric ice boxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein, even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. So with veal birds, these were actually the most common in New York and Pennsylvania. Think popular Midwest areas like Ohio, Illinois, or New England hotspots like Boston. You'd call this Yankee-style home cooking, and it was actually a mix of several different influences. You had influences from both Italian involtini and German rouladen, but hotel rooms and hybrid restaurants tried to Americanize the dish for the palates of the masses. It eventually did become a dish that was okay for home cooks to rely on regularly, especially around the 1920s and 1950s. It was only later on throughout the 20th century that there was a pretty sharp drop in veal consumption. I mean, appreciation for all things retro and nostalgic indulgence aside, this dish is pretty rustic. It was a part of a time where meat was the only thing on people's minds, and whether the bird of choice was chicken, turkey, duck, or a whole other animal, people were going absolutely crazy with how much meat they were consuming. It got to a point where concerns over animal welfare and continuous poaching became a serious matter for the government. Besides that, the whole process was a headache. Stuffing, rolling, and tying little bits of veal took quite a lot of effort, and a quarter pounder was always quicker and in most cases cheaper too. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, Frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop, growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool, showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Now, I swear, this really is a food video. It's just that people had a lot more broader minds than we did back in the day. If you went to Utah, live in Idaho, or ever trekked through the Mountain West in the 20th century, a name you'd be incredibly familiar with would be frog eye salad. This dish actually made its way to several community and church cookbooks alike, but before you start jumping out of your seat and closing the channel, there were no eyes nor frogs involved in this dish. It was just the people's attempt at trying to get their kids to eat a salad for once in their life. The idea was that if the teenagers weren't eating fruit salads on their own, maybe throwing some mayonnaise into the mix would help smoothen things along. They couldn't have been more wrong, though, and the dish honestly ended up just being something only adults and middle-aged couples would eat to avoid letting things spoil. Gotta repurpose those leftovers somehow, right? Despite it not being popular with the intended crowd, the salad did definitely get popular, or at least enough to be called a niche interest. It had a limited presence in places like the Midwest, but it still did well enough in potlucks and the like. Lacy cornbread may as well be the meal of the South. Again, we're dealing with another magical hit from cornmeal, the gift horse that just seems to never stop giving. This time, the trifecta that gives all the magic is just cornmeal, water, and salt. Yup, that really is all you need here. You throw that into a hot skillet that's been lined ever so gently with bacon grease or oil, whichever is your pick, and then, unlike the usual circus you go through cooking cornbread, this time, you get a delicate cornbread with a lace-like exterior. No, that doesn't mean it's wrapped in silk, but the exterior is extremely delicate. It falls apart at a simple heavy touch or the first instance of pressure as your teeth begin to sink into the surface. It's a really addictive feeling, and it's a big part of why rural farming communities in places like Mississippi and South Carolina would thrive on lacy cornbread. The idea for it actually comes from making West African cooking traditions, though, and grain-based batters used to be a big part of their food and how they kept their daily nutrition in check. The idea with them was to fry it, making this super thin cornbread. You would get this cornbread that was so light and airy it was almost inconceivable that it's practically the same bread you've been eating all your life. Today, in the South, many Black families try their best to keep this precious tradition alive, and I gotta say, it's definitely worth trying out. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Bacon. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Yikes! Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. These are some pretty mild flavors. They're sweet, unorthodox, not the kind of thing that would attract a big crowd. Tamale pies, on the other hand, are exactly what you put out when you know there's a crowd of 12 that's aching for a bite. In places like California and Texas, the need for a savory fixing has always been a massive part of people's food choices. Go anywhere in Phoenix, Los Angeles, or San Antonio, and you'll find tamale pie joints a dime a dozen. You'll count at least a dozen recipes just in cookbooks alone if you're the type to read those. It took a while for this to become as ingrained into the culture there as it did. Tamale pies didn't get their reputation without a lot of help from the locals, but they only ever got that help because there was a lot of potential in the recipe. From school lunch programs, office dinners, cookbooks, Mexican-American restaurants on the corner of residential areas and busy streets, everyone had their own take on an exotic but easy pie that no one wanted to miss out on. Authentic Mexican cuisine was powerful. It was loaded with flavor, it was captivating, and it was something that people hadn't had a taste of before, not like this. Tamale pies became a gateway food for many people looking to explore a spicier side of America's food options. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges after all. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment down below with the most shocking meal from the list.